Hello, class, and welcome to the second part of our lecture on emotions in the limbic system. Within this portion, we will be, as always, beginning with a little story about an influential researcher and their lasting legacy. We'll then dive into the biology and pathology of various affective disorders, that is, emotional disorders. And so we'll take a look at the biology and pathology of anxiety disorders, as well as depression, panic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, hoarding, bipolar, and then some areas of treatment. And that will round out our time this week. So let's dive in and enjoy discovering how the brain and the various parts of the brain have their specific roles in regulating emotions. But as we begin, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Neil McNaughton from New Zealand. He's an influential researcher in the field of affective neuroscience and really kind of pioneered the understanding of the brain's role in emotional processes and the development of certain emotional disorders. Throughout his career, he has conducted extensive research in order to unravel the intricate connections between the brain structures and emotional behavior, and has particularly focused his research on what is known as the fear and approach system, which is a fundamental aspect of how our brain responds to various emotional stimuli. He has investigated how different brain structures, such as the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, interact to regulate our emotional responses, and his work has provided some invaluable insights into the neural circuits that underlie emotions like fear and pleasure and motivation. And in fact, the previous lecture, a lot of the information that we have learned from the previous portion of this lecture actually came from Dr. McNaughton's research. Now, I'd like to just kind of delve in a little bit to the fear and approach system as a bit of an understanding of affective disorders. So overall, Dr. McNaughton's research has shed light on how our brains are wired to respond to emotional stimuli, particularly in terms of fear and approach behaviors. Now, the fear system is responsible for our responses to threats and dangers, helping us react quickly to protect ourselves. On the other hand, the approach system drives us toward rewards and positive experiences, motivating our pursuit of pleasurable activities. And so you can think of affective disorders as encompassing a range of conditions characterized by disturbances in mood and emotion, and basically a dysregulation within that fear and approach system that can contribute to the development of these disorders. You can think of depression as an overactive fear system and underactive approach system that can contribute to persistent sadness and loss of interest, often seen in depression. And anxiety disorders, with conditions like, for example, generalized anxiety disorder, can involve an overactive fear system, leading to excessive worry and fear responses. And panic disorder can be considered as a dysregulation in the fear system that can lead to sudden and intense panic attacks, which is a hallmark of panic disorders. And understanding the balance and interaction between these systems is crucial for comprehending the neural basis of affective disorders. And so Dr. McNaughton's research has played a pivotal role in advancing our understanding of how these systems function and how their dysregulation can result in emotional disorders. So as we progress through this lecture, we'll explore a little bit of these issues. Now, I want to kind of dive in a little bit to the biology and pathology of anxiety disorders in general and shed a light on the mechanisms that underlie this. So as far as anxiety disorders, you can kind of think of this as a group of mental health conditions characterized by excessive and persistent worry and fear or anxiety. And they encompass various conditions such as generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety, and panic disorder. And understanding the biological basis of anxiety is essential for both diagnosis and treatment. So anxiety disorders are closely linked to the dysregulation of key brain structures and neurotransmitter systems. And some of the key components involved include the amygdala. Okay, you remember that small almond-shaped structure deep in the brain that plays a crucial role in processing fear and threat-related information. In anxiety disorders, the amygdala becomes hyperactive and hypersensitive to stimuli, and this leads to an exaggerated fear response. There's also the prefrontal cortex, and that's responsible for higher order cognitive functions, including decision-making and emotional regulation, and that can be impaired in anxiety disorder. So basically, it becomes tired, and so there isn't a strong connection between the emotion and the cortex in a positive way, where the cortex is no longer in control and is so much influenced by the anxious thoughts that it isn't able to give good, strong directions to the midbrain anymore. And then, of course, there can be an imbalance in the neurotransmitters, such as serotonin, and this can contribute to the development of anxiety disorders, as well as disruptions in a gamma aminobutyric acid can also be disrupted. But normally, you can think of reduced serotonin levels are associated with increased anxiety. Because remember, what does serotonin do? It tells you that everything is okay. And when it doesn't feel like everything is okay, because your serotonin levels are low, well then of course your anxiety is going to be high. But of course, there are, as I've mentioned before, there are genetic factors. There's a third of people that are highly sensitive to environmental factors that are going to lead to anxiety disorders. And there's a third of people that are very much resistant genetically to developing anxiety disorders. So you need to kind of keep that in mind as well. Now, let's take a look at depression. Depression and anxiety are very much comorbid. If you have one, you're likely to have the other. And that's partly because the systems are related. As far as depression, it isn't just one disorder. There are many types of disorders underneath that large heading of depression, but it basically is characterized by feelings of sadness and hopelessness and a loss of interest or pleasure in activities. So you get a major depressive disorder, is one of the most common forms of depression, but there are variations such as persistent depressive disorder, also known as dysthymia, and a bipolar depression that is focused primarily upon the depressive side would be another example of that kind of experience. And depression is associated with significant alterations in brain structures. So you can think in terms, again, of the hippocampus, that area that it involves memory. It tends to be smaller in individuals with depression, probably because of the chronic stress that has developed through the negative appraisals that they've had within their life. And that's going to tie in, of course, with the amygdala as well at the end of the hippocampus. That becomes overactive in depression. And because of the heightened sense of fear and danger and threats, then there becomes negative emotions, and that disrupts the sense of the connections between the frontal lobe, and that can inhibit the production of serotonin. And so serotonin can be a limiting factor there as well. And so reduced serotonin levels are associated with depressive symptoms. So that's why medications like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, help to alleviate the balance. But as with anxiety, depression, again, there's other factors involved: early life experiences, genetic predisposition, chronic stress, trauma. All of those things can tie into it. And these are long-term. So, like, for example, high stress and chronic stress and trauma can, 20 years later, because of the cumulative effects upon the various systems, can lead to depression. So it isn't necessarily something that happened the previous week. It can be something that happened decades before. And then there is panic disorder. And panic disorder, again, is part of this anxiety depression system, this fear approach system. Within panic attacks, they're typically accompanied by a sudden and overwhelming surge of fear and physical symptoms such as heart palpitation, shortness of breath, and a sense of impending doom. And some people will interpret this as being a heart attack. And panic attacks are thought to involve really a complex interplay of structures and neurotransmitters. But again, a lot of the roles here have to do with the amygdala, that brain area that is processing threat-related information, and that then plays a significant role in panic disorders. But oftentimes, the amygdala, because the amygdala is operating at a subconscious level, based upon where it's located, there can be things in the environment that the amygdala picks up on that consciously we aren't aware of, and that can trigger this. And tied in with this is the hypothalamus, which is involved in regulating the body's stress responses, including the release of stress hormones like cortisol. And so there can be a combination of a dysregulation with the hyperactive amygdala plus dysregulation with the hypothalamus, and that can cause the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis being activated, and that can contribute to a panic attack. And again, there are a few neurotransmitters that are implicated in this system, these type of disorders, and those would be particularly serotonin and norepinephrine. And so having a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor would be one example of a way of indirectly calming things down, and then the other way would be with benzodiazepines, which directly calm down the system. And those are both common treatments for panic disorder. Now, while benzodiazepines are very fast working, and the SSRIs are going to you need to be taking them for several weeks or months before you see really an effect. Then there is obsessive compulsive affective disorder. So here we're talking about the affective disorder, not the personality disorder. Obsessive compulsive affective disorders encompass a group of mental health conditions that are characterized by the presence of intrusive, unwanted thoughts. That would be the obsessions, and repetitive behaviors and rituals. Those would be the compulsions. And these disorders include, it's not just obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, but there are things related to it, like body dysmorphic disorder or hoarding disorder. And the neurobiology of these disorders really need to kind of be mindful that there are a few key structures that are close in their location to what we have with anxiety disorders, but not quite the same. For example, the basal ganglia, that group of interconnected structures deep within the brain, plays a central role in regulating motor functions and habits. And in OCD, there seems to be some kind of dysregulation or abnormalities in the basal ganglia that contribute to the repetitive or ritualistic behaviors, as well as the anterior cingulate cortex. There can be and the anterior cingulate cortex, it has to do with identifying things that are wrong. So error detection and decision making, as well as some emotional processing. And so some dysregulation in the anterior cingulate cortex can lead to excessive rumination and an over-focus upon perceived mistakes, which are often characterized in things like OCD. And because serotonin, again, is saying, don't worry about it, things are fine, things are safe, we know that particularly serotonin plays a role here, although it does seem that glutamate also plays a role within obsessive compulsive disorders. And so again, SSRIs are normally the medication for treatment of OCD, although sometimes glutamate modulating drugs are used as well. And as always, with these, there is variability within the genetics and the environmental factors, as well as family history. Particularly with OCD, there seems to be a higher risk of OCD if you have a family history of OCD, and if there's stressful early life events that can trigger or exacerbate the symptoms as well. And then we come to hoarding. And hoarding is characterized by the excessive accumulation of possessions and really an inability to discard items, even if they have little or no value. And individuals with hoarding disorder often experience significant distress and impairment in daily functioning due to the clutter and disorganization in their living spaces. And the research into the neurobiology of hoarding disorders, it's something that's still evolving, but it does seem that the anterior cingulate cortex is something that plays a role there, that there is a dysregulation in that part when it comes to making the difficult decision of discarding possessions. There's also an area known as the insula, and the insula is associated with the awareness of bodily sensations and emotions. And dysfunctions in the insula may also be related to the emotional attachment that individuals with hoarding disorder forms with their possessions. And so again, we come back to serotonin as being one of the culprits within this. And so medications that target the neurotransmitters of serotonin seem to be the most effective in the treatment here. And again, combination of factors, genetics, environment, neurobiological factors, traumatic life events, loss, and significant stressful situations can trigger or exacerbate the hoarding behaviors. And then we have bipolar disorders. And bipolar disorders, sometimes it used to be called manic depressive disorders, a group of mood disorders characterized by episodes of mania or hypermania. So the elevated mood, the increased energy, and then the depressive moods, the low mood, the lack of energy. And these episodes can vary in severity and duration, and the condition often has a significant impact upon a person's life. And what we know from the neurobiology here is that there's changes in the activity of the mood-related brain regions. And this can include the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the striatum, and they have all been observed in individuals with bipolar disorders to have some kind of disruption within them. And all of these areas play critical roles in emotional regulation and mood control. And there can also be abnormalities in the neurotransmitter systems, particularly those two systems of reward and safety, so dopamine and serotonin. Both of those are associated with bipolar disorders. So, for example, elevated dopamine levels during the manic episodes can contribute to increased energy, increased risk-taking, increased impulsivity, while reduced serotonin levels can be linked to depressive symptoms. There can also be disruptions in circadian rhythms that take place here, and whether that's a cause or effect, we do see that that's there. And also, we need to kind of be mindful of the fact that with bipolar particularly, it's believed that there is a very, very strong genetic component. And so family history of the condition really does increase the individual's risk, while stressful life events and substance abuse and irregular sleep patterns can and seem to exacerbate the bipolar episodes. So having a calm, steady life is clearly going to be beneficial for somebody with bipolar. Now, as far as the treatment with these various disorders, because they all seem to impact upon that fear approach system, there seems to be two primary ways to deal with these, and that is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is essentially identifying and modifying the irrational thoughts and behaviors associated with the disorder, and then developing positive thinking patterns. And these tend to get the system working properly again, and slowly it will heal itself. So that's one way of treating the system. The other way is treating it with antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication, primarily selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which engage the serotonin system, increase the serotonin levels over a period of time, and that eventually will result in some healing and the plasticity of that system, and eventually finding a place that of healthier regulation. Now, in the terms of anxiety disorders, the medications are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, as well as the more fast-acting benzodiazepines to relieve some of the more painful symptoms of the anxiety. With depression, CBT to identify the negative thought patterns and develop more adaptive ways of thinking and coping, and then SSRIs as well as SNRIs, which are serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. Both of those seem to tie in well with helping depression. As far as panic disorders, again, CBT seems to be effective, and particularly here focusing upon identifying and managing the panic-inducing thoughts and sensations, and maintaining some kind of rational detachment from the bodily experiences, as well as the medications, particularly antidepressants, but also some anti-anxieties that will reduce the frequency and intensity of the panic attacks. As far as the obsessive-compulsive affective disorders, exposure and response prevention is a therapeutic intervention that can be used, as well as cognitive behavioral therapy more generally, although exposure and response prevention can be argued that it is a CBT kind of treatment, as well as SSRIs for calming down the obsessive-compulsive disorders. With hoarding disorders, it can be a little bit more nuanced, although antidepressants can be considered beneficial for them, as well as CBT. Specialized CBT with hoarding, that is identifying and addressing the behaviors and the irrational beliefs about possessions, can be very valuable. And with bipolar disorders, though, it's a little bit different because it's a little bit of a different system, because you have a couple of systems working together there. The medications like lithium or anticonvulsants, and sometimes atypical antipsychotics, which basically manage the spiking of dopamine levels, can help to stabilize the mood swings in bipolar disorders. And of course, some psychoeducation, as well as psychotherapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as interpersonal and social rhythm therapy, can help a person manage their moods a little bit better. So you just need to be mindful that there are different kinds of approaches for different types of disorders, but that when you understand the systems underlying the disorder, it goes a long way to helping you to choose the right kind of treatment and to help the person. Now, again, a few key terms that will be important for you to kind of be mindful of. The first one is that the amygdala is that almond-shaped structure deep within the brain at the end of the hippocampus that plays a pivotal role in processing stimuli, particularly associated with fear and threat. And it's something that's implicated in things like anxiety and panic disorders. Remember SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That's a class of antidepressants. We call it antidepressants, but it's used for a whole bunch of things that functions to increase levels of serotonin indirectly. Neurotransmitters, though, like serotonin, of course, are linked to calming down the threat response and making a person feel safe so that they're more open to feeling the positive side of things. And that brings us to cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which is widely utilized psychotherapeutic approach to assist individuals to identify and modify irrational thoughts and behaviors connected to emotional disorders. And so it's shown to be effective in things like anxiety and depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. And then we have basal ganglia, which is that group of interconnected brain structures that's integral to the regulation of motor functions and habits. And so dysregulation in the basal ganglia is often associated with conditions like hoarding disorder. So, hope you enjoyed that part of our lecture. As we close out, I just want to kind of remind you that we delved into, in this part of our lecture, into Dr. Neil McNaughton, who was a New Zealand neuro researcher who focused upon what? Focused upon the fear and approach system to help us understand the emotional disorders. And of course, we also explored the biology and pathology of various emotional disorders, including anxiety disorders and depression and panic and obsessive compulsive disorders, as well as hoarding and bipolar disorders. And we explored how the psychotherapeutic approach of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, helped and why it helps these disorders, as well as the various medications that help and why they help. So I hope that you enjoyed our journey into the brain and emotional disorders, and continue to join us next week as we explore more about biopsychology and neuroscience. You take care, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye.